Good morning, everyone. My name is Luke Tannen, and I'm the Executive Director of Chicago Innovation, an organization that educates, connects, and celebrates local innovative companies cutting across all industries, big corporations, startups, for-profits, and nonprofits as well through a series of events and programs. And we are also a very proud partner and customer of Wintrust. And on behalf of Wintrust, I'd like to welcome you all to today's virtual event, Current and Future Trends in Retirement Programs. And we have a great speaker who will lead today's discussion. But before we meet him, I'd like to let everyone know that if you have a question during the presentation, you can send it to us via the Zoom Q&A while the event is taking place, so our speaker can see what is on your mind and he can try to respond to it at the end. Now, I would like to hand the Zoom mic over to Candice Lenti, Managing Director and Executive Vice President of Nonprofit and Healthcare Banking at Wintrust. Candice has over 31 years of commercial banking experience with almost 2 decades serving government, nonprofit, and healthcare clients. Candice joined Wintrust in June 2011 as Chief Credit Officer, spearheaded the formation of the Government, Nonprofit, and Healthcare Group in 2012, and became Managing Director of this group in 2013. So please, everyone tuning in today, welcome Candice Lenti, who will be introducing today's presenter.
Good morning, everyone. Happy Wednesday. Thank you very much for your interest in today's topic. And I also want to say thank you to Luke and Paul from Chicago Innovation, as well as the marketing team from Wintrust who helped kind of, put all this plumbing together to help us put on this event. We've actually had a nice run here over the last couple months with a handful of virtual events. We like to think through ideas and topics that can add value for our prospects and our customers. And when we run into a good topic and a good speaker, we try to kick those off. So Chicago Innovation and the marketing team has been really helpful for us, but we've been able to do topics on board strategy, virtual gala ideas, and new market tax credits. And now trends in the retirement arena is our final version as we speak right now. So we got to, I guess, come up with some new ideas. Dan has been with Wintrust for 8 years. He has been an incredibly well-respected partner from the customers and prospects that I run into. I think what I've witnessed is when Dan is working with an organization and specifically with a management team, and if that management team moves, Dan always moves with them. So I know he's, a very valued partner and knows this corner of the world, retirement advisory, very well. So I think he's a great value proposition for us at Wintrust to share information in this world. And I'm actually personally excited to hear a little bit about what's going on. Just because long-term planning for everyone is really important. And I think it's something that, all our clients and prospects really need to think through providing the best value for their employees. So Dan, I'm going to kick it to you and thank you very much for sharing your wisdom and your experience with our customers and prospects today. Thank you.
And thanks everyone for taking the time this morning as well. I do also want to thank Paul and Luke for making this possible and kind of making my morning a little easier by navigating for us. As Candice mentioned, I've been with Wintrust about 9 years, executive director of our retirement benefits group. And really what we do is provide consulting and advisory services to organizations and corporations who offer retirement plans, whether that be 403Bs, 401Ks, pensions, as we'll talk about here in a little bit. Our goal is to be really kind of that chief retirement officer for organizations here around the country. So my hope is to do a few things today, just talk high level about some kind of key areas of trends here in the market, and also talk about some litigation, some legislative changes that we think will impact what we do in the retirement plan arena. It's interesting to hear Candice saying she's excited to hear the comments. Very few folks are excited to talk about retirement. And I think that's part of the challenge that we're trying to address with our market today. Is how do we get folks to those successful retirement outcomes that we're trying to achieve through offering a retirement plan, whether that be 401k or 403b. So Luke, if we can start the slide presentation, I'll begin with the agenda real quick. Give me 1 second here. There we go. And so what I really wanted to do today on the second slide is kind of start with what we call a generational divide. It's really meeting the demands of today's retirement plan participant. And that's certainly changed over the last few decades. And we'll kind of highlight, why we think we really need to kind of rethink how we're offering retirement benefit plans to folks. And I think the arena that we're in today has done a lot of that work so far, and we hope to continue those trends. Then we'll talk about those plan design and employee benefit trends that we're seeing today and what we think those look like in the future based on the momentum that has taken place over the past few years. And we'll dive a little bit into the legislative side of things, some stuff that's already enacted today, that being the Secure Act, additional proposals that are likely to come here probably later 2021 into 2022, and then talk about the litigation trends, which they're never fun to talk about, but I certainly think there's some value in identifying what we're seeing there and really how to mitigate some of those litigation risks from the plan sponsor perspective, and certainly welcome any questions as we go through. So let's start, if we jump ahead 2 slides to slide 4. In terms of this paradigm shift, this generational divide, I think if for those of us who are been in the workforce over 20 plus years, you're probably more familiar with some version of a defined benefit plan or pension plan. For those who have been in the workforce a little less than that, defined contribution is really all we know. And we've seen a massive shift away from defined benefit plans the past 20 years. And really the focus now is on defined contribution. If you look, 24% of the Fortune 500 companies, only 24%, offer a defined benefit plan today. That's even a little bit lower in the private sector. And that's really just a continuation of a shift away from the defined benefit world. That said, that's a little bit of a different scenario in the public space. So keeping that in mind, we're really going to focus on the private market trends for the most part as we think through here. But that move from defined benefit to defined contribution has always been interesting to me, as that 401k was really enacted as kind of an afterthought. It was an additional savings program to accompany a defined benefit plan. So when ERISA was enacted in 1974, no one really thought the defined contribution component was going to be the key retirement savings vehicle for U.S. citizens, right? And that's really what we have today. The defined contribution market is the sole savings vehicle for most of us, and will likely be the focal point moving forward, as I don't think we're going to go back too much to the defined benefit world here in the future. With the next slide, please. If we look at why defined contribution makes sense, one is because we have a shift in workforce, right? A generational divide or a change in the generations and kind of how we view retirement benefits is really what's driving a lot of this, whether it be from a cost perspective, mobility perspective. A lot of those trends are changing what we need to do on the retirement plan side. If we look here, today, if we add up the Gen X, the millennials, we have roughly 104 million potential participants in that space, which now dwarfs the baby boomers, right? Who were for years the largest percentage of our workforce. And so as that changes, we too need to rethink how we are adopting retirement policy, how we're changing benefits in the future, and really how we offer these plans and these benefits to participants moving forward. If we go to the next slide, I find a couple of things really interesting. So we're going to look at some of the trends with boomers and then some of the trends with the millennial and the Gen Xers. But if you look at baby boomers, why do they save more? I think this is the key, right? Economic conditions, whether we're in recessionary periods or expansion, healthcare, right? Maybe there's healthcare issues or planning for future healthcare expenses. And third is reaching retirement, right? So those are kind of the 3 goals that we're trying to solve for, if you will, when we talk to baby boomers. That's when they save more. That's why they feel comfortable saving more. So really try to achieve each and every one of those 3 items. Why do they save less? It's usually high levels of debt, unemployment status change, or potential change in current economic environment, right? When we put that side by side, if we go to the next slide to the millennials and the Gen Xers, what's interesting is why they save is very different. If you look, for millennials, it's become apparent for the first time potentially. Again, changes in economic conditions and marriage, right? So you notice that retirement is not highlighted there for someone who's below 50 today, essentially, right? But why they save less is identical, right? It's higher levels of debt, whether that be student loans, mortgages, unemployment status change, and current events in economy. So as I think about this, we're trying to solve many different problems for different generations. And what's nice about the defined contribution retirement plan world is it gives us that flexibility. And as we'll talk about here in a minute, the trends that we're seeing is really trying to encompass additional topics to really help each and every one of these folks with all of these items to some extent, right? We're not, it's not trying to be the end all be all, but it certainly is trying to provide the resources to alleviate some of these financial concerns that will allow individuals, whether that be in the millennial generation or the baby boomers, to save more and have retirement be a focus for them. I can certainly, sit here confidently and say Social Security is probably not going to be the safety net for the vast majority of individuals, thus making the private sector and public sector retirement plan space, a key in making sure that we have the resources for folks to retire comfortably in the future. So with that, we'll talk a little bit about kind of current trends. If we move to the next slide, this is going to encompass a lot of what we just talked about. And you're seeing that the retirement plan market has taken some of this data and really enacted a lot of change already. Our hope is that this change continues and that we move towards a more automated type vehicle for defined contributions. It's funny, we started with the apples and oranges of defined benefit, which is pension, and defined contribution, which is likely 401k for most. And really what I think we're trying to get to as an industry is the automation of the 401k to make it look and feel more like a defined benefit, so that the employee has to make less decisions, potentially has to do more heavy lifting, and really try to make it a seamless transition for them into retirement. So a lot of what we're going to talk about is ideally getting us there at some point in time. So we look at plan design and employee benefit trends. The first thing that stands out to us today is fee compression. Lower cost, that's a good thing, right? Lower cost for the employer, lower cost for the employee, meaning more retirement savings in their pocket. This is being accomplished a few different ways. The first one is increased utilization of what we call collective investment trust, or less expensive versions of mutual funds today. That has been a trend that's occurring and really probably will accelerate here, as we'll talk about later, as litigation trends continue to increase. But what's interesting about the CIT, as we call them, they're not even available today to 403B plans for regulatory reasons. Thankfully, there's some proposals out there to make those available, but more we can do in that space to lower investment costs to retirement investors and plan sponsors, we think all the better. So we think that trend is here to stay. You're going to see a higher adoption of collective investment trust type vehicles for plan sponsors. What are those? They're essentially a less expensive version of a mutual fund that is much more customized to the plan or the business who's offering that investment, right? So it gives us more flexibility on offering, gives us a lower cost structure in doing that. The second part, and this is really ongoing, is plan cost, fee analysis, and benchmarking. Now, this has been around for many years, but what we find now is because of the dynamics of the retirement plan market and how much changes year over year, whether it be technology, as we'll talk about in a minute, provider consolidation, there's probably more reason to do that every year now on an annual basis to see what efficiencies exist from a cost perspective or maybe additional services. And I think that's what we're trying to hope to achieve for all of our plans is let's add service and lower costs at the same time. If we can do that, it's certainly a much more beneficial retirement plan program for the employees. The second biggest trend here, and this will be intertwined through some of the other information we're going to talk about, is financial wellness. And it speaks to those very different goals and objectives from different generations. But what we're seeing now is more interest from folks in identifying potential solutions to help them with things like student loan debt repayment programs, emergency savings, budgeting, HSAs, which are health savings accounts. And what you'll see from a legislative perspective as well is that this isn't lost on what's going on in DC, right? They think that these are programs that make a lot of sense, but we have to kind of implement them in ways that are thoughtful and beneficial to the employee. We've seen a lot of interest in financial wellness in the past few years, and that's certainly been accelerated by the pandemic. With folks staying at home, a couple of things that I think are silver linings. One is that folks have become more fiscally responsible, paying down debt at a higher rate. And actually, the U.S. savings rate reached almost 15% last year when you factor in the additional stimulus checks and things along those lines. So if we can take a lot of what we kind of built during the pandemic in terms of that fiscal responsibility and integrate in things like emergency savings programs, budgeting assistance, and really just enhance the overall financial picture for individuals, it makes it a lot easier for them to choose to save for retirement, right? Without doing that, it's much more difficult for folks to find that extra dollar to increase their savings significantly. So these will all be policy responses that I think we'll get to some extent, and changes in the market that are going to help drive us to solutions that we can offer. When it comes to financial wellness too, there's certainly kind of third-party platforms that we can utilize. We do that internally here at Wintrust, but a lot of the providers today in the market, whether that be the Fidelities of the world, the Empowers, are finding ways to integrate that to really make it one-stop shopping for individuals who have access to a retirement plan through that provider, and really integrating as many other employee benefits as possible. What we like about that is it's fairly low cost in order to do that for you as the plan sponsor or for the employer. And we think there's a lot of value in having these features added in the future. Three, and this is a trend that I think, again, kind of accelerated during the pandemic, is ESG investing, social responsible investing. We've certainly seen an uptick in interest there. Our challenge is the market's still very kind of gray in terms of what those products really are and what they're trying to achieve. And so as we learn more about the product offering and what clients are looking to achieve with moving to a more social responsible investment objective, we're trying to match those up. So I think that's a trend that will continue, especially as we have shifted workforce, right? The younger generation has more of an interest in the ESG investment strategies. And we're seeing that certainly become more popular among many of our plan clients. And we think that's a trend that's here to stay. Number four, and you'll see this again in kind of multiple areas here, but expanded retirement plan coverage, right? That's a little bit of an issue for us here in the US, as if you look back to a 2018 study provided by Empower Institute, approximately only 1/3 of US households, approximately 1/3 of US households are not eligible for a workplace retirement plan, right? It's a fair amount of Americans who don't have access to a workplace plan. Now, in recent years, we've had some states try to adopt things like auto IRAs and state IRAs that we'll talk about. But one of the things that's going to come out of a piece of legislation that occurred in 2019 is what we're calling more adoption of multiple employer plans, or what we're calling pooled employer plans, PEPs. And we think that will go a long way in kind of bridging that coverage gap. That is a trend that is very, very new, right? So really PEPs were just allowed to be established as of January 1 of this year. And it's going to take some time for them to be established and up and running. But for smaller employers or employers who do not offer a plan today, we're kind of thankful that help is coming, right? There's better solutions that are coming down the road here, so that you can find a much more cost-effective, efficient option to offer employees than kind of what exists today if you're a startup or a smaller business in today's space. Go to the next slide. One of the other trends, and this is kind of ties back into fee and cost analysis and the reduction of costs we're seeing, which is again a benefit. A lot of it's due to record keeper consolidation and provider consolidation. So those are the folks who are managing the day-to-day where the assets are held for your retirement plan participants. Again, it's the Fidelities, the John Hancocks, the Empowers, the Transamerica's. And over the years, for many reasons, we've seen continued consolidation. So when less competition, there's less competition there, but ultimately it's actually pushing down margins and fee compression, which is benefiting us as consultants and advisors working with plan sponsors like many of you. So what's causing this, right? One is that there needs to be a continued reinvestment in technology, and it's expensive. And a lot of providers, frankly, just don't have the capabilities or maybe the want or need to do that. So they look for partners to offsource or to purchase their record keeping book of business. That fee compression that they're seeing from a competitive perspective is driving a lot of folks out of the market as well. And it comes back to technology, right? If you're not going to have the capabilities to reach participants, whether it's via an app or a participant website, and continue to reinvest in that, it's going to be really difficult to stand apart in competitive situations. And so as we've seen over the past few years, the very big providers are looking for acquisition because they want more scale, more ability to reinvest in that technology, and maybe more technology in general that they can leverage from an acquisition potentially. Just to give you an idea, last year alone, Empower Retirement, which is now the number 2 provider behind Fidelity, acquired Fifth Third and MassMutual in the last 6 months of 2020. If you're with either of those providers, you probably know you're going through a transition early part of this year. Late in 2019, Principal Retirement acquired Wells Fargo, right? So some really large players are going away. And that speaks to the fact that it's just a very difficult, low margin business for many providers. And so what we kind of envision happening from a provider standpoint is it's going to look and feel like healthcare, where you maybe have 4 or 5 very large providers that we're going to look to for services for retirement plans, and the market of 30, 40 probably continues to shrink over the next few years. And then the last plan design trend, or kind of plan design and investment trend that we see is personalized, what we call default options. So if you're in a plan today, you're probably familiar with target date funds. That right now is about 76% of the time is the plan's default option, meaning that if you do not make an investment decision in your retirement plan, you'll be defaulted into an age-appropriate retirement or target date fund. We think those are great solutions, but like everything else, there'll be evolution there. And so what we think happens there is you're going to see more customized target date funds or more customized managed accounts, which are kind of a second iteration of that, where it's much more personalized based on the employee, right? Whether that's based on their earnings, their current savings, their life goals and objectives. We think the evolution of these default options are certainly going to help employees manage their investments more efficiently. And we like where kind of that part of the market's going as well. You know, that's one area of the market, though, that as we have additional development of services and products, probably drives cost up a little bit, right? The more customization and personalization we bring to the table probably actually increases the cost of the participant. But ultimately, we're going to have more choice in that space. And I think we're seeing a lot of benefits in having both kind of off the shelf and customized vehicles available to participants in all ranges of life and all ranges and kind of stages of their career as well. So let's jump ahead 2 slides, and then we'll kind of look at, knowing those are trends today, kind of what's the future. I referenced earlier, we think we're trying to kind of, it's almost kind of we call it the defined benefitization of defined contribution plans, making defined contribution plans look and feel as close to a pension plan as possible. How do we get there? The first area I think is the key, and it's auto, basically automatic everything. If you're a new employer to an organization today, you're probably more familiar with being automatically enrolled in your plan at a default percentage of 3%, and they're going to automatically increase your contribution every year until, let's say, you get to a cap of 10, right? We think all those features will continue to exist, but on an elevated level. We think auto-enrolled plans now are going to be the rule, not the exception. Whereas in the past, if you had an automatic enrollment plan, you were a little bit ahead of the curve. Today, that is certainly kind of standard, I think, from a defined contribution offering perspective. Where automatic features are already in place, we're going to just look for continued improvement. And that kind of brings us to the third part, where increased initial automatic enrollment deferral percentages. For many years, the initial percentage was 3%, partially because in the legislation that allowed for automatic enrollment, the government put in there that 3% was a kind of a good starting point to defer someone into their retirement plan. When we look back a decade now, almost to the day, since we've enacted those changes, most plans are still at 3%, right? As the demographics change, we probably need to be saving more. So we're calling it 6 is the new 3. Let's start folks at 6% of pay and auto escalate them up over time. The enhanced auto escalation, which is the auto increase, right? So moving folks from 6% to 7% on an annual basis to 8, moving that up over and over until we get to a cap is going to be, again, kind of the new normal. And part of that will be then tied into the increased utilization of target date funds or managed accounts. If folks are being automatically enrolled, they're going to be likely defaulted into an investment. And that automation likely creates a much better experience for plan participants. We tied this in from a prior slide, but more expanded retirement plan coverage through MEPs and PEPs. The other is through state-sponsored automatic IRA programs. So in Illinois, we actually have secured choice, basically with if folks do not offer retirement plan to their employees today, they have an option to enroll those folks into a state-run IRA program. Frankly, in our opinion, those are probably not great solutions long-term for a business owner interested in offering a retirement plan. It's a stopgap solution. So in conjunction with that, MEPs and PEPs are going to be additional options for small business owners to adopt a much more robust retirement plan offering. And again, really increasing the coverage of folks around the country. And there's been some changes to part-time employee eligibility, again, which we think will help engage more folks in retirement plans. So more folks will have access to vehicles like 401ks and 403bs here going forward. This is certainly driven by the pandemic, but the trends were already in place. But more paperless administration and certainly a more virtual participant experience. Department of Labor has some e-disclosure rules and requirements now that exist. that will allow folks to deliver disclosure documents electronically for the first time, making it much more efficient for both the providers and, I think importantly in our eyes, the plan sponsors or the organizations delivering those disclosures. Virtual plan sponsor committee meetings, virtual participant meetings. We were talking earlier, I think that's a trend that will likely stick around because participants are highly engaged when we do education meetings such as this venue this morning. And then almost all paperless plan administration. So whether that be a participant taking a loan or a distribution, we're making a deferral or savings rate change. That will likely all be driven through an app or website here in the future. So again, we're going to have a highly engaged participant by utilizing those vehicles. Now we just have to make sure that the benefits there follow through to prepare those folks for that comfortable retirement we're hoping to achieve. And then the last couple, if we go to the next slide, in terms of what the future retirement plans look like, I think interesting the most, what we see investment menu consolidation. Less is more. We're seeing less investment choice in the plan, partly because the more folks are utilizing the target date funds or managed accounts, which are kind of automatically allocated investment vehicles. But the second is most folks do not feel comfortable making their own investment decisions. And so the core lineup that we traditionally had access to is being underutilized. And that doesn't necessarily, it's not a bad thing, right? We think that folks who utilize a professionally managed account or a target date are probably in a better place down the road than many folks who are not comfortable and try to do it on their own. So this menu consolidation, we actually think helps the participant make more informed decisions. We've already seen it over the past really 10 years where investment menus that used to be 30 or 40 different individual investment options are now down to 15 to 20. And we think that trend moves closer to 12 to 15 over time. Part of that, you also reduce kind of the asset class overlap and redundancy. You'll see a lot of plans today that have 3 large cap funds or 4 large cap funds when there's not a lot of difference in terms of investment thesis there, right? So by consolidating and just giving one choice, it makes the decision a little bit easier and simpler for employees engaged in that plan. And then as maybe kind of an offset, if we take away some investment options from the core lineup, we're seeing more plans look to self-directed brokerage options as an alternative for those folks who are more sophisticated or who want to do something a little different and outside of that core investment menu. But that menu consolidation will likely continue to occur here going forward, and we'll likely see a much smaller suite of investment alternatives for most plans in the future. We think we're going to see fewer required minimum distributions, which is a good thing. And this is really driven from the Secure Act, which we're going to talk about here in a minute, which has increased the RMD age to 72. There's more potential legislation that would actually probably increase that even further or maybe remove it. So again, we think folks are not going to be required to take money out of the plan at a certain time, or potentially that's the case. But right now, we're going to see fewer of those, which kind of alleviates some administrative burden as well. And then lastly, and this has been kind of a bullet point of ours for years on a slide like this, but annuities. This is probably going to be something we're going to see integrated into defined contribution plans here going forward. Now, I will say that with knowing that the product development is not there yet to find a solution that we think is going to be that valuable. But what we're trying to do again is create a pension-like investment for a retirement plan that is defined contribution. So if we can get someone to age 65, how do we provide some guaranteed income for them out of that retirement benefit that they've built up over the years? And this annuity, or whatever the kind of guaranteed income product is going to look like, is going to be the vehicle to get us there. There's certainly a need for retirement income. We think it's going to be mostly effective if it's integrated with something like a target date fund or a managed account, where again, it becomes automatic for the employee once they reach a certain age. But in order to get there, right, the current annuities propose some challenges. They're very costly, they're not very transparent, and they're very complex. So we think we need simplicity, lower cost, and some version of integration. And I know there's many of our investment providers in the space today, like Vanguard and BlackRock and Fidelity and others, who are working really hard on finding a solution to integrate here. Because we think if we do that, we create a much more efficient experience and a much more probably successful outcome for retirement plan employees in 401k and 403b plans. So we'll talk a little bit about legislation before we kind of wrap up with some questions. So there's going to be kind of 2 parts here. One is we're going to start with the Secure Act of 2019, which kind of got lost in the shuffle of 2020. But this was actually passed in late 2019 and really became effective January 1 of last year. It really touches on, in our opinion, kind of 7 key areas. One, as you've heard multiple times, that multiple employer, pooled employer plan solution, rules relating to election of safe harbor for 401k plans, smaller employer automatic enrollment credits. So again, trying to get folks to adopt automatic enrollment plans, portability of lifetime incomes. So that ties back to our annuity conversation. If we have a solution, we need to make sure they're portable from plan to plan. Increase the age for required minimum distributions, which we just talked about, part-time employee exclusions, and then disclosures regarding what that lifetime income would look like. So I'll just touch on these briefly, and then what we'll do is kind of tie it into what we're calling Secure Act 2.0, which is being proposed today in DC, and we think is likely to occur sometime in the next 12 to 18 months in some variation, which really will expand upon many of these legislative items that were already enacted earlier in 2020. So go to the next slide. From a policy standpoint, the highlight of this bill, the Secure Act, was this multiple employer, pooled employer arrangement. It accomplished a lot of things, but kind of the highlights, most importantly, it's allowing 2 or more unrelated employers to join a pooled employer plan. So to put that in comparison, prior to the Secure Act, if you were an unrelated employer, you could not join together to offer a plan to your employees without some commonality among the business, whether that be from an ownership perspective. So really what this allows is small businesses of any type, any size, to really band together for efficiencies and economies of scale. Now there's some catches that come along with this, but we think there's a benefit in doing that for smaller businesses, smaller organizations who want to offer a 401k or a 403b, but frankly, it's too costly or too time consuming administratively. So this is going to allow unrelated employees for the first time to do that. The one bad apple rule was always kind of a key in the past, which is eliminated going forward. And really what that means was if you had a multiple employer plan prior to the Secure Act, and one individual organization, whether it was be fraudulent activity, fiduciary challenges, the rest of the plan became at risk, right? And so by eliminating this rule, we can essentially take out that bad apple, and the rest of the plan, the companies who have adopted this plan can exist going forward without the risk of having one, bad entity in there, kind of messing it all up for everyone else. And again, there's a lot of technicality behind this. I'm going to try to keep it at as high a level as possible. But we think right now, the way these are designed, this is really going to make sense for smaller employers to begin with. And certainly as it ages and it becomes much more mature, we think that these pooled employer plans become a little more attractive upmarket, the $5 million space or above, the $10 million space. But we're likely 5 to 10 years, I think, in our opinion, away from seeing that really mature to that point. Design pooled employer plans must have a named fiduciary, be responsible for the administration, which we call 316 administration. And they must register with the Department of Labor and the IRS with ERISA bond limits increased to $1 million. So it's going to act and look like a regular 401k or 403b plan, but with some other factors that need to be included in order for it to qualify for this pooled employer plan arrangement. And they can begin, again, January 1st now of 2021. So we're just starting to see kind of the first few pooled employer plan relationships. We have a multiple employer plan version right now. It's being quickly adopted by very small employers as well, with 5, 10, 20 employees. So it's a very cost-effective, efficient way to offer a much more robust retirement vehicle than what one may get in the kind of state IRA or auto IRA programs that are offered by many like Illinois. The second feature there, just rules related to election of safe harbor, really making it just a little bit easier to offer safe harbor plan or amend it. What you're going to see as we go through the next few slides, a lot of the Secure Act just made things a little bit simpler from an administrative perspective, or just allowed more flexibility. And that's kind of the way we like to see legislation, obviously. And we think what we're going to get with kind of the next iteration of this. Go to the next slide. So here we've got, smaller employers adopting automatic enrollment, just providing additional credits. So it creates a new tax credit for up to $500 per year to employers who want to defray the cost for their 401k plan or their simple IRA programs. The credit is in addition to the plan, what we call plan startup credit, which is also allowed. And the credit is available to employers that convert an existing plan to automatic enrollment after December 31st of 2019. So as you can see here, right, as we talked about, automatic enrollment is going to be kind of the only option, I think, for plans in the future. And we're trying to incentivize now the smaller employers to adopt that vehicle as well, as most larger employers have really adopted some version of automatic enrollment already. Portability of lifetime income. Again, this is a lot, I think, more to come, I would say, in terms of this, because we don't have a lot of lifetime income or annuity options that exist today. But what this is going to allow is qualified direct trustee to trustee transfers of those vehicles in the future. So a lot of this legislation is laying the groundwork so that if we do, and if and when we do get a really viable lifetime income solution, it makes it very portable and transferable for employees to leave one employer and go to the other and carry that benefit over. We did increase through the Secure Act the cap on automatic enrollment safe harbor. Now, this is only for those folks who use the automatic enrollment safe harbor, which we call a QACA, qualified automatic contribution arrangement. Not many plans utilize that today, but if you do, that in the past, the cap on the automatic enrollment contribution percentage was 10. That is now increased to 15, right? So just really an enhancement of a lot of these features. And again, I know a lot of this can be somewhat redundant and kind of get in the weeds, but a lot of these are just enhancements to what we already offer to plan sponsors today. If you go to the last slide in this section here, again, we think there's a couple other benefits that happened out of this. One is that the Secure Act repealed the contribution rate, or I'm sorry, the contribution age on IRAs. So it used to be an individual who was 70 and a half. After that, you cannot contribute. Contributions now can occur at any age for individuals. Part-time employee exclusions. This was another big part, especially for a lot of our non-for-profit employers. It did change how those folks who are part-time are calculated in terms of benefit availability potentially. And so if you look at kind of the second bullet point in the past, the way we've kind of calculated it, if an employee worked more than 1,000 hours, they would be deemed eligible for most retirement plans without exclusions, unless they were part of a collectively bargained group. Going forward now, instead of 1 year service in that 1,000 hours, if an employee has 3 consecutive years of 500 hours or more of service, they would then be eligible for that retirement benefit. So that's just a little more of an administrative challenge, I think, for a lot of organizations that have a fair amount of temporary or part-time employees. So this is something that we think will actually maybe get an additional change here under what we're calling Secure Act 2.0. And then lastly, disclosure regarding lifetime income. Employers going forward, and this is really going to fall on the provider, so don't be too alarmed, are going to be required that every 12 months, we provide a benefit statement to employees, showing them what their retirement benefit today is and what that would project out to be in terms of monthly income for retirement. Now, a lot to be sorted out here on how that's disclosed, what sort of assumptions need to be made. So kind of more to come, but a lot of the websites today from providers already give us this information. It's really going to be extracting that and putting it into some annual benefit statement going forward. Again, I know I covered that quickly, but want to get to a few slides if we go one more ahead on what we think is kind of the next iteration of this bill. And that's what we're calling Secure Act 2.0. And really all it's doing is taking a lot of the features we just talked about and building upon that. And it's actually called in Congress today, Securing a Strong Retirement Act. It's actually got a lot of bipartisan support, believe it or not, given what's going on in Washington today. Both Chairman Neal and Kevin Brady have co-sponsored this bill and has a lot of traction already. In our opinion, it may be some of these features are included in some omnibus spending bill like infrastructure, but this is kind of low-hanging fruit, if you will, for Congress to pass something in bipartisan nature. And what you're going to see as the next few slides go through is just taking a lot of what we built on the prior slides and making them either enhanced or easier benefits to apply for participants. So the first is required minimum distribution reforms. So again, we went from 70 and a half to 72 under the Secure Act. We're likely going to go to age 75 if this bill is enacted here later this year or next year. There's actually also talk about removing that age altogether, like I said earlier. So kind of more to come, but again, more reprieve in terms of required minimum distributions. It's also going to increase the catch-up contribution limit at age 60. So this is kind of a new wrinkle. Today, you're able to put a catch-up in the plan at age 50. This would allow an additional catch-up at age 60 or above. And it's going to increase that limit from $6,500 to $10,000. So allowing the older part of the workforce to put even more money in if they can afford to do so later in those working years. They will have it indexed based on age. But again, we think this is just kind of an enhancement. So there'll be likely two kind of catch-up contribution limits, one at age 50, one at age 60, with an additional limit increase there for those folks. If you go to the next slide, and as kind of an additional iteration, as I referenced earlier on the part-time employees, the bill proposes decreasing the 3 consecutive year limit of 500 hours to 2. So again, making more folks eligible quicker for qualified plans. Again, kind of really just trying to bridge that coverage gap that we talked about so many times. Providing what we're calling qualified longevity annuity contracts. This ties back to the annuities, providing some limits and some restrictions, really guidelines on how those can be included in retirement plans. So this is going to tie into that annuity development, the product development that's going on today. Really, the laws and what's being provided legislatively is going to provide the framework for us to have some sort of income producing vehicle in a transferable method in retirement plans here in the future. They're also going to create, if this bill is enacted, retirement savings lost and found. I actually think this is a really nice feature as well. It's going to create an Office of Retirement Savings. It's going to be administered by the PBGC, the Pension Benefit Guaranty Corporation. And really what that's going to provide is if an employer leaves your organization, there'll be a place for that account to be sent or housed, so that if an employee doesn't have to come back to you as a plan sponsor, they'll have kind of a clearinghouse to go to find any lost assets that may exist, or maybe they forgot about at some point. So really simplifying, I think, some of the administration for plan sponsors. And one part of this bill, I think that's going backwards a bit, but participants must receive an annual paper statement unless they opt out. You know, for everything moving so far into the technical world, technology, paperless administration, this bill is bringing us back just a little bit, partially because many employees just don't go on and log onto the website, don't log into their email to check for statements. So at least a one-time annual paper statement is going to be required if this bill is passed as well. And then the last piece on the next slide, which is really I think it was been born out of Abbott Labs and a private letter ruling they received just a couple years back, is making matching contribution on student loan payments and tying that into the retirement plan. Now, this can be kind of overly complicated, but in theory, really what it's trying to do is allow matching contributions on qualified student loan repayments. Again, there's going to be kind of broad definitions here, covers indebtedness for higher education. Employer may rely on employee certification that it is, again, kind of a qualified education expense. There's going to be a lot of guidelines that need to be put in here, but really the goal is to make student loan repayments eligible for match that may not exceed applicable contribution limits, and then reduce by employer contribution. So using, let's say, a match contribution from the employer to fund repayment of student debt repayment or student debt as a way to kind of offset contributions. And so again, it can be a little complicated, a little messy. I think we're on the road to having this enacted to some extent, but more to come on the guidelines that are going to be required if employers want to use matching contributions to help employees pay down that student debt. There's student debt repayment programs that exist in the market today, but they're not integrated with qualified plans. This would be taking that next step and integrating it and allowing those contributions to be tax deductible and applied to employee account balances. So certainly more to come on all of these features, but we think there's a lot of certainly momentum on this front that will push us in a direction where some of these, if not all of them, will be enacted sooner rather than later, or variations of these rules and proposed rules will be enacted. So again, as they are, certainly, plan administration will change a bit. The participant experience will change in terms of what they have access to. And so plan providers and advisors like ourselves will certainly stay at the forefront in making sure that plan sponsors are equipped with how to handle those moving forward. And then as we wrap up, if we jump 2 slides in, and we'll talk a little about litigation trends. We talk a lot about legislation, a lot about trends in the market. There's certainly trends as well in litigation, and 3 key components really stand out to us here. If you look at any of the cases that have been established recently or in the past, those 3 that really stand out. It's excessive fees, conflicts of interest, and now cybersecurity. But what's interesting is if you look on the very top of this slide, Groom Law Group out of DC last year calculated that more than 200 ERISA class action lawsuits were filed in 2019. I'm sorry, in 2020, it was an increase of 80% over 2019 and double the number in 2018. There are a lot of litigation firms out there today who are looking for potential settlements in the retirement plan space. And frankly, if we look at, and we will here in a second, a lot of the cases that have been filed, they've typically settled. Not many have made it much through the legal system because it's easier just to kind of settle and move on for whatever the claims may be. But those claims are typically related to one or if not two of the three items listed below. So we talk about excessive fees. This goes back to that plan fee benchmarking that I referenced earlier. Best practice, review your plan fees and costs annually. If you do that and you can document that you've done that and that are competitive and reasonable, you're not going to have excessive fee claims. Unfortunately, for the institutions that have, they have not gone back regularly and reviewed the cost or the potential cost savings they had access to. And so just not asking the question of, can we reduce our cost or do we have additional efficiencies is really what's being, kind of being called into question, if you will. When we look at excessive fees, they come in a couple different ways. Investment share class utilization. I referenced earlier the utilization of collective investment trusts. And there's also lower share classes available of many mutual funds. And so if you're a plan sponsor today and you're not asking that question of either the investment provider or the plan provider, you could be held liable for that. For instance, I'll use a case where the plan had a Vanguard 500 index fund. Given the amount of assets they had in that, they qualified for a less expensive share class. And because they didn't offer that to their employees, again, there was the excessive fee claims from their participants, right? So in Vanguard is not expensive, but they didn't have the less expensive version available to them, thus causing them to kind of be called into question. And then the other, and this happens a lot on the 403B side, where you have maybe multiple plans that exist today, but it's using economies of scale to benefit in the plan and the fee negotiations. If you didn't pool all your employee assets together, employer assets together for fee negotiations, this happens a lot. And again, like in the 403B space, that gets called into question and has certainly become a highlight of many of the litigation trends we're seeing here today. Conflicts of interest drive a little bit from the excessive fees, but this is where you have revenue sharing built into the fund expenses that are going to pay a third party. Maybe those revenue sharing payments are variable, which creates an inherent conflict of interest. Maybe those revenue sharing payments, as you look at the second bullet point, are going to a proprietary provider. So for example, if you have a Fidelity plan today and it's all Fidelity investments, those are all proprietary funds that are obviously being managed by Fidelity, but they're also your record keeper. And that creates a potential conflict of interest if they are providing you any sort of guidance on which investments to choose, or more importantly, your participants. And so kind of cleaning up those conflicts of interest, any revenue sharing payments that go back and forth between a Fidelity and maybe any other provider, right? You should be aware of those and make sure they get cleaned up as much as possible. What we're seeing in that space is the removal of all revenue sharing payments whatsoever in the retirement plan investment menu. By doing that, you eliminate almost 100% of the conflicts of interest that could exist, and it simplifies the cost and fee structure of your plan. And so if you have plans or funds today that have revenue sharing, you certainly want to see if there's more cost-effective share classes available. If it's possible to remove all those revenue sharing payments, you certainly want to do so. And you certainly want to reevaluate any proprietary investment products or investments that you may have. If I think about, we'll talk about here in a second, some of the cases that have been brought, some of your largest financial institutions their plans have been called into question, mostly because of the proprietary investment solutions. So BlackRock, for example, was sued by plan participants for having too many of their own BlackRock funds in there, right? And if there's a more cost-effective alternative from a non-proprietary investment solution, you should probably evaluate that too. So those 1 and 2 are really intertwined, and those two are likely the reasons most of the plans, as we'll see on the next slide, are called into question. And then more recently, we're seeing cybersecurity issues. And what you're going to see as part of that now is enhanced employee authentication requirements and continue upgrades on the provider side of things. Cybersecurity risks come from cyber criminals trying to take distributions out of a retirement plan participants' account. We've seen that for many providers. where folks will kind of call in, try to authenticate themselves as an employee, and take a loan or a distribution on their behalf. So plan sponsors and plan providers are going to have to ramp up that cybersecurity to ensure that that's not even a viable solution for cyber crime here going forward. Then lastly, just look at some of the organizations and companies called into question. And this is not a knock at any of these plans, but I highlight it because it's easy for anyone to be called into question on the litigation side of things because of what we just talked about. And the overarching theme on all of these is fees and or conflicts of interest, or some version of the two. If we look, even firms like Morgan Stanley and Franklin Templeton, big investment firms, their plans were called into question. Local groups here in Illinois, you had Career Builder. You obviously have Northwestern, which was just recent. So a lot of really big organizations, and these trends are certainly working their way down market as well. We're seeing the litigation trends creep into the middle market, which would be under $500 million plans, even some smaller market plans, $10, $11 million up in Minneapolis about a year ago, called into question, all for the same reasons. Just document why you have a plan in place, that you've monitored your plan fees and expenses, that you've asked the questions to have less expensive share classes or costs put in place, and that you're reviewing it on a regular basis. And that's why we think that annual review or benchmarking goes a long way to kind of check all these boxes. The one other, I'll kind of highlight here, ABB is kind of in the middle of the page. This was a really big case from a few years back that was a fairly noticeable settlement, I think north of $70 million, I think, when it was all said and done. But again, this kind of speaks to just being transparent and documenting why you have service providers in place. But one of the claims among many was that Fidelity they're providing their record keeping and administrative services to the retirement plan while also providing the business payroll for free, right? Or for a discount. And so in that case, ABB was utilizing the employee assets in the retirement plan to benefit the business in terms of a lower or minimal cost for payroll, right? Those are things that we need to avoid. Those are kind of self-dealing to some extent, right? But again, there's some, it's Fidelity kind of offsetting the payroll costs with revenue they're receiving on a totally separate employee benefit plan. As long as we don't have those circumstances in place, those litigation risks should be minimized. But it certainly drives back to costs, fees, understanding what you're paying, most importantly, who you're paying those services to, or who you're paying for. And lastly, making sure that's documented and analyzed on an annual basis. So I know there was a lot there. I'm going to certainly try to answer as many questions as I can in the allotted time we have left. But I'll wrap it up there and open it up for any questions should you have any. Looks like we have one question so far. And the question is, how does retirement advisor education intertwine with employers' value proposition, financial literacy for its employees? And are we seeing more appreciation by employers to invest in their employees' financial literacy? And that's a great question, Candace. And the quick answer is yes. And I think, again, a lot of the trends have been driven by stay at home, work from home, and the pandemic. And now that we've had more access to utilization of services like this and apps, we're trying to drive as much content and connection to the participant as possible. And so employers are viewing that as a really valuable employee benefit. Yes, it's related to the retirement plan, but we're thinking about it as kind of a holistic financial wellness program that exists. And that's going to intertwine a lot of what we talked about earlier in terms of budgeting, student debt repayment assistance. Any of those items are going to be kind of an all-in benefit offering to employees going forward. Thankfully, they're lower cost and they can be integrated with a lot of the providers we talked about today and really any retirement platform. But we're seeing an increased interest from employers in offering those services and making sure that we're making available as much as possible from a financial literacy standpoint to the employee base. Any other questions out there? I'll give it just one more minute and then we'll wrap up. Well, again, we want to thank you all for the time this morning. I know it's somewhat long-winded, but there's a lot certainly to cover in our space. And obviously, like I said earlier, there's more to come. But we appreciate you all taking the time and the level of engagement. If I leave the folks with anything, typically it's just make sure you review your plan regularly, because a lot of these issues that we talked about today are certainly avoidable. But a lot of the changes and trends that we're seeing today can also be enacted through regular review as well, making sure that the plan's really meeting the needs of your employees, your participants, and that's really specifically designed for your organization. We say all the time, there's no two plans that are designed alike, and that likely is going to hold true. So, if you have questions, certainly use this as a resource. That's why we're here. We don't offer any products in the retirement plan space, which we enjoy. And we're just a resource from a consultant and advisory perspective. So again, I want to thank Paul, Luke, Candace, everyone for their time this morning and their help in putting this together. Hopefully you all found it helpful and informative, and we look forward to seeing you all soon. And thanks again. Have a great day.